Hello, Internet. School Psych Gamer here. The topic for today is something called ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences, and its relationship to something called toxic stress. And I thought, what better game to discuss toxic stress in than League of Legends? By now, I'm guessing that probably many people have heard about this, Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, but for me, I was completely unaware of ACEs until I was participating in a workshop in 2018, and the presenter casually dropped a statement about the ACEs study, something like, like in the ACEs study that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And I was not in any way familiar with it, but it sounded important. So I immediately pulled out my laptop and tried to find anything about this mysterious ACEs study. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with League of Legends, it's a top-down game where you control a hero character that has special abilities, and there are 5 of you against 5 other, real people online playing their characters, and you also have these little minions, and each team has towers, and then a final crystal at the end, or like a home base, and if you destroy the other team's towers and their home base, then you win. And if the other team destroys your towers and your home base, then they win. And this is a simple mode called ARAM, where you get randomly assigned a champion or a hero to play, and so does the other team, and you just have to battle it out and do your best in this one kind of bridge. So it's a game that I think is a lot of fun. It was really hard for me to get into because it requires a fair amount of skill, and I am terrible at it. I'm not very good. But it's still a lot of fun, and this is a game mode that goes pretty quickly. But League of Legends has been known for having a pretty toxic environment. In fact, most games that are like this, so there's others, Dota, have had to really combat the toxic environment because players will really kind of get after others and say some pretty terrible things to each other. The reason why I like playing this game mode is because it's pretty quick, it's pretty straightforward, and it's the more casual mode. And so in this game mode, people usually they don't talk all that much for the most part, and they aren't as critical of each other as they are in other game modes. By the way, if you're enjoying these videos, I would appreciate it if you could click on the thumbs up button to give it a like, and then feel free to subscribe as well if you're interested. So briefly, the story goes something like this. Again, talking about the ACEs study. So back in the late 90s, a questionnaire was sent out to about 13,000 adults to ask about their childhood exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences. Things like living with someone who is addicted to drugs, having a parent in prison, seeing violence committed against mothers, being yelled at regularly, etc. So some of these things had to do with being the direct victim of abuse or trauma, but others had to do with even just having things happen in the house that were not great. And then they asked a bunch of questions about outcomes later on in life, like did they have any problems with alcohol or drug abuse, or depression, or even physical health problems like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, or obesity. And any guesses on what they found? Well, they found a few things. First of all, more than 50% of respondents experienced at least one ACE. More than a quarter experienced at least 2 ACEs, and around 16% reported 4 or more ACEs. So these experiences may be more prevalent than we might think. But here's where it gets fascinating. So they found that adults who experienced 4 or more ACEs were 4 to 12 times more likely to abuse drugs, be depressed, or have attempted suicide. 2 to 4 times more likely to have generally poor health, and about 1.5 times more likely to be severely obese. And there was a strong, what they called graded relationship between the number of ACEs and the severity of the outcomes. That means that as the number of ACEs increased, the likelihood for these negative outcomes later on increased at the same rate. And it didn't even matter what specific ACEs they'd been exposed to in childhood. It was just the number that was most predictive of the negative outcomes. And this wasn't just a fluke or an outlier. In fact, this study, or modifications of it, had been replicated over and over again with similar results. And in this game, I'm playing a mage character whose name is Rise, and I've got the green bar above me, so everyone else has blue or red. I've got the green bar. That's my character. And basically, what I do is I toss out these spells, and I try and do them just as quickly as possible. Because if I chain them together, then it does more damage. And I'm a little bit squishy, which means that I can die pretty quickly if I'm not careful. But if I can chain several spells together, I can do a lot of damage, which is what I'm trying to do. And I'm doing an okay job. Not great. Oh dear. So what you're seeing right here is that anytime you die, you go back to your spawn point and you get to buy new items that make your abilities more powerful or give you more health, or in this case I bought some boots, so that makes me walk a little bit quicker, things like that. And one of the most unfortunate things that I think we know now about these ACEs is that we have evidence that shows that these negative outcomes can actually be passed on to children during gestation. So infants that were born to women who experienced 4 or more ACEs were 2 to 5 times more likely to have poor physical and emotional health outcomes by 18 months. Now I know that's not, so that's kind of early on, and obviously things can change. But when we see those early concerns, that's problematic because a lot of those will go on to develop into greater concerns later on. And I wondered, how is that even possible? Like how does that get transferred on to an infant or a child during gestation? Well, it happens through basically excess activation of the body's stress response systems in what's known as toxic stress. So, toxic stress is what happens when children experience multiple ACEs that triggers stress responses in the developing brain and in the immune system, metabolism, and in the cardiovascular system. So, we have all these stress response systems throughout our bodies. And when kids have that kind of stress response occurring frequently and over time, especially without protective factors like supportive adult relationships, it wears the body down. Something like revving the car engine for weeks at a time. And as for how it gets passed down to children, this toxic stress can cause abnormalities in genetic programming during fetal development. So basically, if a mother in particular, where it's been studied, I don't know the impact of ACEs in fathers, but in mothers where it's been studied, where they've had this toxic stress, it basically impacts the genetic programming that happens during gestation. So then kids that are frequently or repeatedly exposed to these adverse childhood experiences can have their stress response system so overwhelmed that they can respond to any amount of criticism or raising of a voice or other, generally normal occurrences as if it were a life-threatening event that triggers a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. So if you've ever interacted with kids who can kind of blow up or run from a school or building or become suddenly aggressive in response to these very small or very typical events, it may be that they've been exposed to ACEs, which causes toxic stress, and biologically they may be completely unable to control their reaction. So for me, one of the big takeaways from this information is to have empathy for kids that we know have difficult backgrounds. Unfortunately, I interact with far too many kids where they're experiencing these kinds of adverse childhood experiences at home, and we see these kind of big and explosive behaviors at school. And while the immediate reaction for many may be to respond with, consequences or punishment, having empathy and working on building relationships often is a much more effective response. Another takeaway that I had is that we should try and do whatever possible to reduce the number of ACEs that kids experience in order to prevent later problems with both mental and physical health. From even just like a financial perspective for society, it makes sense to invest resources early on to reduce those ACEs if possible, rather than trying to remediate through costly medical procedures and therapy and things like that. So, but I wanted to see kind of what others have said, with this information, what we should do with it. And according to the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, there are three primary ways to improve overall outcomes for children and families. And I have a link in the description for a number of websites where you can get this information as well. And you can see there's some good infographics and good resources. So, number one is to support responsive relationships for children and adults. The most common protective factor for kids to develop resiliency and overcome hardship is having at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult. And this goes back to what I was talking about in a previous episode on relationships and just how powerful those positive relationships can be, even for kids with really, really challenging behaviors. And I find that very hopeful because in a very literal sense, if you're able to really be there for just one child, even if they have very little else in support, if you're a teacher or a school counselor or an adult, community member, friend, whatever, that is able to build one meaningful relationship with a child, even if they have all sorts of other, terrible things happening in their lives, you might be the difference between a student or a child that thrives or that continues to struggle and has these, major long-term negative outcomes. So a focus on relationships is critical, and that's something that I very much identify with. So at this point in the game, we're in a pretty good position because we have one of their towers down, and all of our towers are still up. So that is something they could certainly come back from. And in this game, you'll often see where there might be these snowball moments where suddenly the other team gets a good, they have a good team fight. They may clear out our whole team, and then we're out of the game for 30 seconds, and they can just push and kill our minions and kill our towers. So you should never really get too cocky in this game because there's always a chance that even if you're in a good position, things might turn around and you could lose. But where we're at right now, it's looking pretty good. The second thing we can do is to strengthen core skills for kids and parents. And core skills are things like time management, adapting to changing situations, and resisting impulses. And these are skills that kids develop, or don't, over time, and nearly always with supportive instruction and feedback from an adult. So these are best taught through those caring and responsive relationships that are developed between kids and adults, hopefully parents or other caregivers, but if not, maybe a teacher, counselor, coach, someone else in the community, etc. At this point, if we destroy this crystal, then we start spawning super minions, which are really big minions that help us fight against the towers and will help us win. So that was nice that we got that down. At this point, we probably need to fall back because now they're all here again. And finally, number 3 is to reduce sources of stress. And that's for both, again, parents and for children. And obviously, some level of stress is to be expected. That's life. But the unrelenting stress that some kids and adults experience when they're in situations of poverty or intergenerational trauma, community violence, parental substance abuse, etc., just causes these really long-lasting problems for kids. And if we can help to meet parents' needs by making sure they have access to decent employment and health care, food, shelter, etc., we can reduce the frequency and the amount of time that kids spend with their stress response systems activated. And this will protect them against developing long-term toxic stress that, again, leads to these real significant mental and physical health concerns that we've discussed. So I guess that's pretty much it. I mean, this is something that I wasn't aware of until recently, but since learning about it, my perspective on many kids with behavior challenges has been shifted for the better. And I feel like I've been able to better support some of the struggling kids that I work with. It's also helped me recognize that some of my bad habits, like when I sometimes raise my voice at my kids, they just really aren't doing anything but getting them in a stress response state. And I've seen how when I escalate, they will often react in kind. If I have a hard time keeping my cool, my kids, for the most part, are going to have a hard time keeping their cool as well. And that's not what I want for my kids. So it's helped me to be more aware of how my actions impact my kids, for better or for worse. And once again, I just think that focusing on relationships is critical. And this is looking pretty good here. We're doing a pretty good job. I'm guessing we're probably just about to win. So this is me, School Psych Gamer, saying adverse childhood experiences, especially ongoing ones, can lead to toxic stress that has all sorts of negative mental and physical health impacts. And if we want kids to be more well adjusted, we need to focus on providing positive adult relationships, teach critical skills, and try and reduce sources of stress for students and adults. See you next time.
Victory!